These days, the conversation around America's energy future tends to focus on technology: solar, wind, natural gas, hydrogen. But behind every project and every megawatt, there's a place. And more often than not, that place is in rural America. This is Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler. As electricity demand grows at rates we haven't seen in decades, and while reserve margins have shrunk, the pressure to build new infrastructure is mounting. But it can take a decade or more to get a new power project operational. Pipelines, power plants, renewables, and natural gas are all urgently needed and all face growing headwinds. So today, we're talking about turning NIMBYs into YIMBYs. But it's not just about permitting hurdles, regulatory bottlenecks, and supply chain delays. And don't get me wrong, all of those pose serious challenges. It's about something more human: trust, culture, and community. In this episode, we're talking with Curtis Wilkerson. He's the founder and CEO of Orion Strategies, and he's spent the last 2 decades helping energy developers bridge the divide between where they're from and where their projects are going. We'll talk about what happens when values don't align, how populism is changing the rules of engagement, and why a job pitch just doesn't cut it anymore. Curtis brings stories from the field where infrastructure meets resistance and where the difference between success and failure often comes down to who's in the room and what they're saying. We'll hear how values collide while projects stall and what it really takes to build trust and infrastructure on the ground. So Curtis, thanks so much for joining us today on EPSA's podcast. Before we get into the details of what it is you do, how does one get into the business that you're in? I assume your degree from college wasn't in infrastructure development and siting, and this is no easy job. So I think people would love to kind of hear how you got there from here, because most people say, I never thought I was going to do X, but here's how I found my way in.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. I had my degree was in political science, as you can imagine. It's the kind of way many of the folks in our world get there. I bounced around for different political campaigns in states, mayor races in Georgia and AG races in Virginia and so forth, and congressional races. And after a while, I found that companies needed the same skill sets, and that's how we got into it. At the same time, the energy stuff would have a background of working with energy companies, but I was always fascinated when shale development came on 20 years ago, and they were looking for fresh faces to come in and assist them and needed those skills, and we started getting calls.
Awesome. Okay, so with that behind us, let's start big picture and we'll drill our way down to some of the details. From your view, why is it so critical that we get energy infrastructure built right now? What's the state of play, and how do you help get from the start line to operations?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that most people realize is that there's going to be an enormous demand for electrons on the grid. It's just what it's going to be. And the United States needs to have its own energy security. Since we've had domestic energy over the last couple of decades, at the end of the day, it actually creates a more peaceful world, because if you don't have to depend on other people across the world for your energy, then you are in a much stronger financial shape and therefore in a stronger national security state. But to get there, we have all kinds of people who are throwing up roadblocks inside this country, and it's on the permitting side, and it is on the policy side as well. And that policy, I'm talking about at local levels as well as state, national. And everybody has different perspectives of what the best type of energy is going to be, about whether or not we need base load fossil dispatchable, or we need green renewable, et cetera. And so the truth is, if you're going to have an all the above strategy, that we need to have a genuine or solid approach to getting permitting done. And to do that, we need to figure out how to deal with all kinds of opposition that we're seeing out there. And it is across the political spectrum. This is not one side or the other. We're seeing it all over the place. NIMBYism does not have a political registration.
I think that is, you've kind of walked right into the next question, because that's one of the things, or several of the things that are kind of critical to what our members do, but also virtually any project development. Local opposition to new infrastructure has kind of always been a challenge. But I think, I've heard it said, and I think I agree, that we've gotten away from NIMBYism and now we're into banana, which is build absolutely nothing anytime, anywhere, near anyone. And
Right.
on top of that, permitting and policy reform changes and supply chain issues have made building things timely darn near impossible. And of course, that's where you're trying to help people get over the top on that. From your seat, how has the landscape changed at the local level in your experience? I mean, is it just fundamentally altered? Has it been a slow boil where this is what you would expect, or have you seen some dramatic shifts in the local approach to infrastructure development?
Yeah, I think there's really two pieces to that we've seen. One is a significant shift to populism, and that is both liberal and conservative.
Ours
And
indeed.
and so what really gets my attention about that is that you used to have local officials to say, I know some people are upset, but this is best for the community. It's best for our national security. It's best for whatever. And instead, now we have people who are elected with this populist tilt from the left to the right, and they say, well, if people are against it, I guess I have to be against it too, as opposed to doing, stepping up and being, I'll just say it, the adult in the room and saying
Yeah.
this is good stuff for America, that we need this kind of infrastructure. And instead they're kowtowing to some of that stuff. And so opposition groups have found they ratchet that up and they go after it. And so there's a lot of hand holding that has to happen, where years ago we didn't have that. The other
Hmm.
piece is that really is standing out is um, that there was a situation where years ago you'd have people who were being very pro development because it was pro jobs, and we could get into that. Now it's shifted to the developers for it. If there's potential for labor unions to be doing the work, they're for it. Then everybody else is either against or neutral. And the
Yeah.
neutral is what's driving everybody crazy, because they'll say, we need more friends out there. What do we need to do? And so you see these developers trying to get into more philanthropy and do things that they can build community relationships.
Yep.
And we've got a ton of people who say, okay, I won't be against you, but I won't be for you either. And so that becomes a real problem in the curve of developing these projects at a local level. And that's really what we've seen shift in the last several years.
Yeah, let's take half a step back and help people understand how long does it take to get a project built right now? And you can kind of run the gamut because I know you help people with all types of projects. So
Yeah.
kind of help think about that. And if you can add a little local color, how does the local decision makers impact the timeline?
So that timeline has gotten longer and longer,
Sure.
obviously. So let's take and there are engineers, developers who would be even better at the numbers than I am on this one. But you've got these projects that used to take 3 years for development, 3 years for construction and roll. So it'd be like, okay, that's
Yep.
what it's going to be. We are working on a project right now that I believe is going to go to construction later this year, that started in 2015.
Wow, 10 years ago.
Yeah. And so you start to look, and it's because they have life cycles. They
Yep.
die and then someone picks them up and comes back. And so you have all these, for lack of a better phrase, zombie projects that,
Yep.
for whatever reason, miss their cycles. So, like, you can get a project through all these humps, and all of a sudden you take it to the market for debt and equity, and suddenly the market's not interested because it's the wrong timing or whatever. And so it goes off, and then who wants to continue to make payments to keep the queue position and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
We're seeing the other issues with certain RTOs, and we have all kinds of reasons for it. But you start to look at certain projects in even PJM specifically, and the delays that have been caused there over the years. Well, that's an enormous amount of time for the opposition to get rolling. And
Yeah.
so you have all the people who may be on the flip side of an industry, not just a project nationally, have plenty of time to do their research, come in, set up websites, organize opposition, and really roll over a project.
And to be clear, this is true on both fossil-based projects, but also
Absolutely.
renewable projects. It's not
Absolutely.
unique to one or the other, lest anyone think that this is,
That's it.
only project type X is subject to this. All types of projects are subject to this, correct?
So our firm works with natural gas pipelines, power plants. We have hydrogen projects, carbon sequestration projects, solar, wind, and all of them have opposition. Different tone and a different flavor that comes
Sure.
at it, but it's the same thing. And these groups are learning from one another and what they can do to slow stuff down.
So I think it's clear to pretty much everyone that these days, most energy development is being done in rural areas. And that's true whether it's wind or solar, transmission, new plants, whether they're
Yep.
gas plants or what have you. And you've noted there's a disconnect between what developers are seeing and what the opposition may look like. Is the opposition coming from the local community? Is it from urban areas? Is it kind of the third parties that just have grievance will travel kind of a thing? Or kind of how is that changing the way you do things. And can you talk about the political and cultural diversity in the areas that you're working on? Because I know your firm's doing it in a number of
Yeah.
states. It's
Yeah.
not like you're only in one jurisdiction. So
Right.
you've got a pretty broad lens to look through. Can you kind of walk us through some of that?
So the right now we've got projects we're doing in 20 states. Just to get you
Okay, so you have a very good lens then.
Yeah, and so that is, and they're all being built in rural areas because you build
Yeah.
energy projects away from population centers,
People,
and
right.
it's because it's easier, right? There's two things that are happening in parallel there. One is there's a lot of energy corporations that are located in urban blue areas and see the
Hmm.
lens through the world of shareholders and development, and they are living in that very urban world,
Sure.
but they're developing in rural America. And so like there's a disconnect sometimes that's happening there just strictly because of that piece. They don't know how to speak that language, which is a really fundamental concept. And most people go, well, of course, we'll just go out and we'll talk about jobs and so forth. Rural America's not looking for jobs. They've got jobs. They don't have a high unemployment rate. And if you tell somebody that you're going to build X and it's going to, in their mind, displace another energy source, then it's a net zero at best. And then they say, well, how does it benefit me? And what are you doing for that? So there's a breakdown in the communication of the topics, of the attitude. There's nothing quite like being in rural Louisiana and bringing in somebody from a northern city as a client, right? And having the police just go, what are you doing here? Like, I remember I specifically got asked one time and said, boy, what's your role? And I said, I'm just the arm candy. That's all I am here. And they loved it. But my point about all of that is that divide is enormous. And so we sit down with clients often who, if they come from that background and they don't get
Hmm.
the rural piece, that they're dealing with conservative perspectives. I mean, it's a conservative voting area. And we're not just talking about which side of the ticket they're punching. We're talking about on issues and so forth.
Yes.
And so I have seen massive disconnects when sending the wrong person representing the company into that area because the individual doesn't fit the mold of what that rural America looks like.
Yeah.
And so what we often find is about identifying who can communicate in a similar tone and can connect with people from a cultural level. I mean, they don't have to be from there. They just have to have common experiences and understandings. If you're going into the farming communities of the Midwest, having somebody who grew up on a farm or understands farming is very helpful. And they could be from Georgia or they can be from Idaho, but as long as they understand that. So there's that kind of breakdown. The second point to your other part of the question, though, is that those areas historically are finding that because of that cultural piece, some of the stuff becomes a litmus test and becomes a culture war issue. So the oil and
Talk
gas
about making your life more difficult.
exactly. There's a project we are doing right now in the West where there's a coal facility, they're building a new nat gas facility, it's going to utilize hydrogen, and there are certain individuals who are against it because they don't understand the technology completely. Some of them do, some don't. But some of them are like, "What's wrong with the coal units? Like that's fine, and it's been up there for 4 decades, and what's the problem?" But it's also about they don't want to do anything that, in their mind, would support, in their phrase, a Green New Deal. And so we are seeing pushback on carbon sequestration projects in areas that the oil and gas industry want it to happen, and it's in conservative rural areas that should support it because it supports oil and gas jobs, but they think it's going to be a ding against them locally from a political perspective.
So can you put a finer point on it? What happens when the values don't align, or potentially even worse, when the values do align, but the outcome is squirrely? How do you navigate that? I mean, you've mentioned the messenger, which made me smile a little bit because sometimes the message is what it is, but sometimes it does make a huge difference who's bringing it. But as you look at that from that little finer point, what happens when you just have value misalignment? Can you still successfully develop a project, or if you recognize it, you say this isn't the right spot, and make the recommendation to the client that you got to think different?
So when the client comes to us early and says, "Help us understand the politics before we decide if we're going to move forward or not," then it's great. But when they come in and say, "We're already invested and we're doing this, help us navigate it." So, do you have a problem or do you have a political problem, or a public relations problem versus the fundamental one? We have seen the ability to sign on local champions who are, let's say, a local elected county commissioner who says this is the right thing to do. We're going to have some opposition to it. I don't care. This needs to happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes those people lose their seats, and so then how that goes.
Right.
And this county commissioner lost his seat, but he's like, I'm still doing it because it's the right thing to do. This is going to bring in X number of jobs. It's going to, and what one of those value propositions that comes in is taxes. Because it's not just about paying taxes. It's that they say, if these people are paying taxes, you don't have to have your taxes raised, and maybe we can lower them.
Exactly.
That becomes a very palatable message in order to help get that across the finish line.
Imagine that kitchen table issues still matter.
Frustratingly so. And it's like, and this becomes especially true when we have clients who are international and they're doing it in the United States, and they'll say, well, we need to come in and talk about the development of green technologies. And we go, no, you don't. You need to talk about what matters to those people locally at that point. And so early in the process, we will do a lay of the land memo to find out what the political standings of not just the individuals at the county level, but throughout the county are our region. We will look to what other projects have done in the area and what kind of wells have been poisoned figuratively by that. And then at the same time, we'll do studies about what the actual environmental and economic issues are, because this don't often come up. You don't often have a question of how many people have access to city water. What's the high school graduation rate of a specific area? What is the average traveling distance to work? And those are the things that if you really dig into the numbers, you can find what those kitchen table issues are that no one thinks about top of mind, but you bring it up and they go, oh yeah, that's an issue. Absolutely.
So you've covered a lot of ground there, and it makes me want to start at the negative and come back to the positive. But do you have examples of projects that failed or were stalled due to either situational misunderstandings or, boy, we thought we had things figured out, or the client came to us late and thought they had it figured out and there was no redeeming the project, or it took us 2 more years because we had to reestablish kind of the base and then move forward? Is it possible to get a project done if you've had that kind of a misread at the front? Or if things have gone south, does that mean it's time to pull up stakes because you're behind the 8 ball?
We have seen both of those.
Okay.
We have seen projects that were, the statistics have changed from year to year, but it used to be that, and this was before the queues got flooded with a whole bunch of new renewables.
Right.
That's only about 1/4 of announced generation projects ever moved
Actually
forward.
get done.
Like just what it is. And so we would see people stumble on certain areas because they didn't fully value what the opposition could do to them and their pinch points. And so the reason I bring that up is because we had a natural gas power plant that was proposed. It was moving forward. Everything was solid, and they had a location picked that they thought was perfect because it was in an industrial area.
Right.
And the opposition was immense. And it was a local community that lived on a hilltop above this industrial area. And they were just aghast at the idea of a new natural gas power plant being in their eyesight. And what was already there was rail yards and coke processing plant, like turning coal into coke.
Yeah.
And it was bellowing out black smoke. But that was there before the houses were built. So it was always there. And it was just like, and their response to it was, but we don't even see that. And it was awful. It smelled like burning tires. It was just, and they were worried about a new nat gas power plant bringing down their home values. And you're like, you literally have a 70-year-old facility here that's bellowing out this black smoke and smells horrible. You could smell it from miles away. And you think a clean burning natural gas power plant is going to be the problem. And so they didn't do the research ahead of time. And so they announced where it was going to be. And then they called us and said, now go sell it to the community. And they were shocked by it. So they had to end up moving the location of the project, which ultimately did not work out. On the flip side of that, we have seen projects. We had a solar project that had immense opposition, and it was all due to where the poles for the Gentile lines were going to go and how it was going to interrupt drainage ditches and drainage tile and all that. And when you're dealing with agricultural communities, that's imperative, right? So we had to end up working with that, and it died and came back 4 or 5 times. And the way we got it across the finish line was by working through realizing who our audience truly was. So there was literally going to be 1 or 2 people who sat on a drainage board who had to have the technical understanding, And it was, we are going to answer every question until they're satisfied.
Yeah.
And that delayed the project about a year and a half, but then it went to construction. But that's
Yeah.
what happens in those situations too.
It's interesting, as we've talked about this, we often hear about the federal or statewide issues, but you're really dealing with some of the local implications. But the entire political spectrum, I think, needs to be reminded at times about the importance of energy and how critical it is. The world is changing, even as you and I are speaking, where demand is going up. It's somewhere between 2 and 10% year over year. We haven't had growth like that in 40 years. We're
Right.
going to have to respond, which means more infrastructure is going to have to be built. You're going to be very busy, I assume, but it, communities are going to have to figure out what makes sense for them, and developers are going to have to figure out what makes sense in order for it to actually be able to be sited where it needs to be, or we're going to miss the moment. And nobody wants that to be the case. And you've been talking about how opponents and supporters, I think, have both been learning from good and bad experiences, but how have tactics shifted? Whether it's on the I'm trying to get a project done or it's opponents that are trying to stop it. I assume you're going to utter the phrase social media at some point, but how have tactics evolved to try and help meet the moment? I mean, in the end, we all want to deliver reliable, affordable, cleaner power from, here going forward. But how's that actually being done in the political and the practical sense, from the tactical getting it done perspective that you're kind of the guy that's in the hand-to-hand combat, not, in the ivory tower looking down saying, well, just get it built, Curtis. What is the problem?
Well, and it's interesting because years ago we would be like, all right, we're going to roll into a specific community very quietly, have quiet stakeholder meetings. That part is still holding true. It's then what comes next. Very quickly, you have to pay attention to who is listening to the populace, like who's responding to that, and are not necessarily your friend. So
Sure.
research is skyrocketed. We
Yeah.
do so much research, and we can call it opposition research and land research and EJ research to know what we're walking into.
Hmm.
That's a huge deal. The second thing that has happened that's very different from years ago is that whether we're talking about the days of early oil and gas or new, nat gas power plants coming online where it was kind of a novel thing, there wasn't a history of projects that were bad. And that is a real problem today, is that everybody
Yeah.
knows a project that went off the rails or insulted them or had their old debts to pay all over the place.
Yep.
And so that changes the strategy. And the reason I'm starting with strategy, because then that gets into the tactics. The other piece that gets into this is back to that whole idea that who supporters actually are. Because back then, 15 to 20 years ago, these projects were new and interesting. And so you could rally support around them. And now they're old news. And so, again, it's like the opposition gets formed very quickly, but the
Yep.
proponents are the developer and anybody who is going to directly benefit financially from the project. And so people want to talk about third-party advocates all the time. Those have gone away. We've really been leaning on what we refer to as second-party
Okay.
advocates. Those are going to financially benefit. So,
Okay.
first party is the developers, second party is all the contractors, unions, et cetera, that may benefit from it. The natural gas suppliers, or the solar panel, anybody's going to be connected with. Third party needs to be genuinely third party. They're doing it for the good of the community. And we still have to have those individuals weigh in, and there's a value chain there. So the tactics have gotten to the point where we look at what is surgical first in order to go in order to, it's almost like when colleges do big fundraising campaigns and they have 80% of the dollars raised before they ever announce
Before
it.
they announce, yeah.
So it is about doing all of that foundational work. And so by the time it gets announced, it's about compressing that timeline as short as possible. Again, back to the earlier conversation, when we have certain queues being dragged out so long that it then allows the opposition to get creative. So we've been doing a lot of direct mail in order to hit, because if it's on social media and it gets strung out wrong, that becomes a real problem. Information websites are getting more detailed so that we can always point back to them, even if it's not the number one use of it, but the regulators see that the effort was made. But then the other piece on it is we're going to make sure that we're advertising in multi-bi-directional communication systems. So, and what I mean by that is we're going to do digital ads. We're going to do standard newspaper ads. We're going to hang up flyers in public spaces for that event. The reason we do all of that is because there are certain regulatory bodies who are going to say, well, did you communicate with people of different technological abilities, access to broadband, different languages, different ages, different education levels. We want to be able to answer yes to all of that. The hope is that when someone's submitting a permit application, they just take our report and staple it to the back of the thing and send it in.
That's your best case scenario, right?
Exactly. That's a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's great. I think it's helpful for people to see just how much goes into this. It's not just plug and play and you're good to go. And I should have asked this at the outset, but in your experience, is this same challenge around siting true of, competitive developers and vertically integrated utilities and pipelines and transmission infrastructure? Like it's across the board in your experience,
It
or no?
really is. Yes, it absolutely is. There are, and the pain gets shared, right? And it depends on where you are, because in certain places, utilities aren't developing anything of their own anymore because they just abdicated the generation side. But even we were doing a project on the East Coast in a oceanfront community, like really East Coast, for natural gas development, for local not natural gas development, natural gas delivery for a natural gas utility. In that situation, without going into a huge, long story, going way down a rabbit hole, we made it as boring as possible. It was a FERC project. Everybody was fine with it. There was a couple of people who were upset, but we found out, we did the opposition research, found out they weren't from the area. So when we talked to the locals, we were explaining to them that these are interlopers and this isn't your voters. And they were like, okay, well, we're going to ignore those people.
So you mentioned various parts of the country. You said, I think 20 states that you're actively working on projects in. With delays that are happening in certain parts of the country for interconnection, and frankly, that's more of the country than not these days.
Yeah.
How's that impact public engagement? You talked about shortening timelines. I mean, you might have all your ducks in a row, but if you're dealing with interconnection queue issues, how's that impact your ability to complete a project?
It is going to make more and more projects not come to fruition. And it's because opposition has time to build.
Yeah.
We are seeing, even if there's some of the local opposition is genuinely grassroots, it gets fed by experts who are coming in to fight it. And it is not just environmental organizations who don't like fossil, and it's not certain fossil groups that just hate green projects, which is unfortunate, but it is happening.
Right. Because we're trying to get electrons on the system, right? We talked about that a couple of minutes ago. Like, hey, we have load growth. We need it all.
Yes,
and
that's right.
If you're ready to go, it doesn't matter what type of resource you are. We need to figure out how to get you to completion because we're going to need those electrons. Yeah. So because you do a broad range of projects, I want to kind of get your thoughts on, are there differences between linear projects? And by that, I mean like pipes and wires versus locational projects. So you've got a power plant that's going to occupy 50 acres in one county, or you've got a 50-mile transmission line that's going to be maybe across states, or it's going to be across multiple counties. Are you seeing a different level, or is it just a different flavor of the same type of support or opposition dynamics that you've been experiencing on all the other things we've been talking about?
Yeah, it's a different level. There's two reasons for that. One is that if individuals are opposed to it, then they realize that there's multiple points of failure along the pathway.
Yeah.
And so they go after the weakest links and start. So you're not fighting county X, you're fighting 15 counties, all showing up for one meeting and so forth. When we do these types of projects, we end up doing different plans for every county or community it's passing through. And so it becomes 15 times the work or whatever. Yeah. And those types of projects, even though they have very small corridors, like all of a sudden people are opposed to them because of what they represent. I mean, we've seen these fights with a whole host of name brand pipelines across the country. Power lines are getting the same thing. And we haven't had a significant transmission line fight in this country for a number of years. I mean, there's been some here and there, but we haven't had that additional boost that was going on. As you mentioned before, there just wasn't that many new electrons coming onto the grid by comparison, because we were just kind of replacing total load. But now we're going to need all kinds of new transmission. But it's also Gentile lines if it's going to go any distance whatsoever. We're working on a project right now that it's almost 10 miles of a Gentile line to get to a substation. Well, that's opportunities along that pathway that affects that site specific. It's not even transmission at that point. It's just getting it connected. And pipelines are the same deal. We've seen projects that the pipeline was almost an afterthought because you had the nat gas power plant who was going to develop the project and somebody else was going to supply it. And the gas supplier just didn't get their act together till too late. And the opponents of the power plant, they go after the pipeline because they realize it's a pinch point to cut it off. And so then they can do it the entire length of that distance and become really problematic. So yes, it's very much so.
This, as I'm just kind of shaking my head saying, well, you want to know why infrastructure takes a while and it's so expensive. You're kind of explaining it, chapter and verse for people why it is the way it is.
Todd, the president of Williams, was down at CERAWeek in March and said that two-thirds of the dollars they put into a new pipeline is in the regulatory side of it and getting a permit.
Two-thirds.
Two-thirds. So for every dollar, 30 some cents is construction.
And 67 cents is just getting the field ready to do it.
Exactly. It's engineering permitting. That's crazy.
Yeah. So that kind of leads to a question I've got, and I'm very curious your perspective because we are hearing more and more about this. But where do private property rights these days stack up compared to prior years when it came to energy projects? As you know, there's been a lot of debate and discussion about eminent domain and all the various issues that are part of the process. How's that functioned for you in the work that you do?
Yeah, we found historically that we could really depend, especially on local Republican elected leaders, to stand by private property rights heavily. That has begun to get undermined hugely. The populism effort has pushed back against that, and an individual, because it used to be, well, I'm not for it, but if it's on private property, that's their say, blah blah blah. And now the narrative is switching to, we understand it's private property, but the larger community has to be protected to get rid of solar, wind, natural gas, whatever. And it's an interesting shift that's happened because we had in rural areas a very pro private property rights, anti-zoning narrative that used to be there that has been disappearing. We're seeing rural conservative counties that are passing rural zoning. And they don't call it that. They'll call it land use and so forth, and they'll talk about advanced planning. They're getting around the zoning word, but they're still doing the same thing. Possibly one of the more troubling things to me, because we are seeing this significant shift in the fundamentals of political ideologies that then are really hitting those areas. And when we're talking about developing projects in rural America, that's what matters.
You used to know your playing field, and now the pieces are being moved. So from just a policy perspective, how can governments and companies work to support better engagement practices? I mean, it's clear that given that that's what you do, you understand kind of the how-tos and what's required. But at the general level, for regulators or state policymakers, what's the best way to get the right level of engagement, or what needs to happen state, local, federal when it comes to permitting reform or other legislation that would both accelerate and yet ensure private property rights are protected, that we're still doing all the right things by the environment, all the things that need to be done. But I don't want to use the crisis word, but we're at a point where we got to move faster than we've been moving the last 15 years. If you had a magic wand, what would it look like?
I would put finality to the appeals process on all kinds of permits. I mean, really, that's where it's like someone says, well, and it depends on what state you're in. They say, well, I'm going to appeal it. There's an appellate division, that entity. And then it goes to a circuit court, and then it goes up to a larger court system, and then a state supreme. It's like, we need to have finality on the appellate process of any permitting. That's key. And that's a state issue. That's not even federal. And that more states had that, and some states have begun to put that into their code, but that really needs to ramp up. The second thing is that the amount of time that environmental processes take for permitting is flabbergasted by. It should be that if we could have a magic wand again, and because of the entities that the feds then allow the states to cover, it would be lovely if the states were to say, sure, just pay a larger application fee and we'll get it reviewed by a third party, and if they sign off when it's done, as opposed to all this internal stuff. And people are like, we're getting to it as quickly as we can, but there's just too much. And that slow down that process allows for opposition groups to really come in onto it very heavy. The third area that I have is that when we cut the budgets of certain groups, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who have to review these projects, that's a problem. And so
Yeah.
while, I have friends of mine in the energy industry who may not be best friends with Fish and Wildlife because those are the people who tied up my pipeline permit, et cetera. The more we cut their funds, that becomes a real issue, and it slows
Yeah.
projects down, and they feel that there's retribution going on, and they should be feeling the opposite. It's like, well, let's speed this up by making sure they're fully funded and doing their jobs. So,
Yeah, it sounds like our takeaway is that we've got to move faster. There are ways to do it, but
yeah.
we've got to kind of be thinking collectively about how we're going to meet the moment and achieve the outcomes that we want. So
Yep.
I'm gonna finish with some rapid fire questions for you. Short answers preferred, but not required. Favorite U.S. senator?
All right, now Senator Captive.
Hardest place you've successfully developed a project of any kind?
Yeah, it's Utah. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Will permitting and siting reform get done this Congress or ever?
Not this Congress, and I would be shocked if it's done in the next 5 years.
What's your best guess for load growth and new resource demand by 2030? You can do either gigawatts or percentage.
I think we're looking at 6% a year at least, and somewhere in that 5 or 6% range, which is something we haven't seen since the 1960s, which will be huge.
Wow. Will there be a pipeline through New York that will supply New York and New England this decade?
Yes.
What are three things that we need that will help ensure that we can ensure resource adequacy from your seat?
Appellate process being well defined,
Yep.
the ability for NEPA to be reformed, like that's a whole other situation, and I guess
Yep.
into the thing I don't know that will happen in the next 10 years. But more than anything, I wish that we could get developers to early in the process understand the politics before they decide on what the projects are.
If you could make three changes to law or public policy that would make it easier to deliver solutions in the energy space, what would they be?
A faster analysis process on SHPO and archaeological stuff, because that slows down stuff when everybody knows that often it's not going to be a reality. The second thing that I would recommend is that we are back to my earlier point, fully funding the agencies that are doing the permitting for us.
People can do the work.
Yes. The third thing is at all levels of government that I wish that there was the ability for more entities to farm out the reviews and a pay for faster speed to speed up the permitting through higher fees.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. Well, Curtis, you've been very generous with your time today, and we certainly appreciate the perspective of not an asset owner, but someone that's actually trying to help get infrastructure of all types built and constructed and dealing with all kinds of jurisdictions. You've got the battle scars to prove it, and we're certainly grateful that you took the time to chat with us today. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me be a part of this. This is fantastic.
That's it for this episode of Energy Solutions. A big thank you to our guest, Curtis Wilkerson, for sharing his insight and experience from the front lines of energy development. As electricity demand continues to rise, we'll keep exploring what it takes to meet that need reliably, cost-effectively, and in ways that work for communities across the country. From public engagement to permitting reform, this conversation is just one piece of the puzzle. If you'd like to hear more, check out our past series, Energy Rush, where we hear from over a dozen experts on load growth and what it takes to build the energy infrastructure America needs. Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. The music for this episode was composed by Let Me Hold That Ltd. If you like this episode, please share it on social media or with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on X at EPSA News and on LinkedIn. And subscribe, follow, leave a rating or comment on Spotify, Pandora, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, head to epsa.org for more updates and actionable energy solutions.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 175,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.